Today we will be going over the third video in section 1, getting up and running with Meteor, and this will be an introduction to Meteor scaffolding. Whenever you start a project in Meteor, you're going to want to have a very specific file structure. The reason for that project folder structure is to make sure that everything executes cleanly, and what gets executed on the client and on the server, or on both depending on your folder structure. Likewise, the order of execution is also determined by the folders that your particular files may be in and by the names of those files. And then finally, there's some visibility and scope issues that we'll want to cover. Okay, so the first part of this has to do with the basic folder structure. Whenever you start a project, this is pretty much the three folders that you're going to create. The first one is a client folder, a server folder is the second, and then the third is pretty much anything else, but we're going to use the word model. Now the first one, the client folder, will execute code on the client only. That means that you don't have to worry about interfering with anything on the server. Likewise, there's a server folder for anything on the server. It keeps your client and server nice and clean. And then you have pretty much anything else. Any other kind of folder will activate on both the client and the server. So a typical setup will look like this. You'll have your client, you'll have your model, which you'll keep your collections inside of, and that executes on both the client and the server. And then you'll have your server folder, and that keeps a nice clean separation between the two. We're now going to look at the order of execution. Okay? Depending on what your folder structure looks like and what your files are named, they will actually execute in a different order. There are 4 orders of execution. The first one has to do with the lib folder itself. The lib folder trumps pretty much everything else. If something is inside of a lib folder, it will run first. Then comes subfolders. Anything that is a subfolder to a parent folder will run before anything inside of the parent folder. Next comes the alphabet. So if something is labeled with an A.js versus a B.js, the A will run first. And then finally, there's one rule that trumps them all, and that's a main.star. Whenever you have a main.star rule, that means that it will execute last no matter what, even over lib. We'll actually see an example of that down here below. So we have listed out here various different files that have printed out to the console. First one we have is the client lib tests and model lib test, and you'll notice that these follow the rule about lib trumps everything. So because they are in a lib folder, and also because they're alphabetized client and then model, they executed in that order. Right? The next 2 files start with an A for a subfolder and B for a subfolder. So these follow 2 rules. The first is that it's actually a subfolder, and the second is that they are alphabetized. So that's why they ran in the order of aardvark and then bravo. And finally, we have something just regular in the root client test folder. And then we have client lib main and client main. Now you'll notice that that's inside of the lib folder, and that's pretty interesting because lib's supposed to trump everything. But as we mentioned before, it's a main.js, and the main.js has the last word. So following these basic 4 rules, you'll be able to make sure that your code executes in the proper order. And now we come to visibility and scope. Okay? There are certain files and folders inside of Meteor that help us to be able to produce static content or view static content or keep files hidden. The first 2 that we want to talk about have to do with server-side interaction and static content. The first one is public, and the second one is private. Now, the public folder serves static visible content such as images, and the private folders also serve static content, but it's only available on the server side through a library called assets, and we'll see how that works in just a minute here. So we've gone ahead and created 2 folders, the private and public folders, and inside of the public folder we've got a nice logo. And if we look inside of the private folder, we've also got a text file called private.txt. Okay, here's what the logo looks like. It's just the Pack Publishing logo inside of that public folder. And inside of the private folder, we've got a little message there that says it's visible by using assets.getText. Okay, we'll see exactly what that looks like right here. This is the assets.getText call, and this is able to access that private folder and then print it out to the console. And we'll see what that looks like. Right, so if we go into a browser and we type in our local host, and we don't have to use public, we'll just go ahead and put in packedlogo.png. Lo and behold, there's our file. We'll now flip over to the server console, and in the server console we'll see that assets.getText worked properly. There is the contents of that private.txt file. So both public and private give us some really great options in how we can access static content. We're now going to go over the rule about anything. Now, this is anything with a dot on it. If you put that in there, it will be hidden from a server refresh. This comes in very, very handy when you're looking to upload images and you don't want your whole server to restart. Because anytime that there's a file change in Meteor, Meteor will restart and refresh the page. Now, finally, we come to client/compatibility. Now, there are certain libraries out there that make use of the var declaration whenever you're declaring variables. It's a pretty smart thing to do, but it's a type of legacy code according to Meteor. Now, if you have the var declared in a regular file, then that file will actually be invisible, as you'll see in just a moment here. We have that one. And now if we click into compatibility, we've created a compatibility folder, and we'll do the exact same thing, except this time we'll call it visible, and the only difference between invisible and visible is which folder it's in. This one is in the compatibility folder. The other one is in just a regular folder on the server. So now let's see what that looks like. In the console, we can see that var visible is truly visible, and that's because it was declared inside of the compatibility folder, whereas invisible, which was not declared inside of compatibility, is not defined. And it doesn't matter if we manually look for this, we're going to get the same result. So if you have legacy code, make sure you put it into compatibility. Okay, so we went over a project folder structure for a basic project, which includes a client folder for client-only code, a server folder for server-only code, and then pretty much any other folder. We use a model to make sure that we declare our collections for both the client and the server. Now, we also went over order of execution and visibility and scope, which can help us to really keep our code fresh and tight. Our next video is very exciting. It's creating your first app. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you then.